Коллеги, добрый день. Рада вас видеть в Банке России.
Good day, colleagues. Happy to welcome you to the Bank of Russia. We're now starting the news conference in the follow-up of Board of Directors meeting given by Elvira Nabiullina, Governor of the Bank of Russia. She will start by making a statement and then you will have a chance to ask questions. Thank you. Good day. As you know, the Bank of Russia today has decided to keep its key rate on hold at 11% per annum. Why have we taken this decision? It is true that in February, early March, external conditions and the situation in the Russian economy and in the financial markets improved. Oil prices picked up, inflation declined, recession slowed down, the ruble appreciated. However, there still remains high uncertainty with regard to the oil price dynamics, the external conditions, as well as the sustainability of positive trends that we've been recently observing in the Russian economy. Given the situation, it would be sound not to act rashly, to prevent moving in the opposite direction afterwards. Stability and caution in monetary policy are very important. We must ensure a steady path of reducing inflation to our target level, which is 4% by the end of 2017. We are convinced that only low inflation is guarantee of stability and low interest rates in the economy. In order to keep interest rates steady and low, we first should ensure sustainably low growth rates in consumer prices and a decrease in high inflation expectations. Then, proceeding from this, we will have stable and low interest rates. This requires consistency and gradual interest rate policy of the central bank. This is why, in order to achieve its inflation goals, the Bank of Russia may pursue a moderately tight monetary policy for a longer period of time than was previously assumed. Now, I would like to indicate the factors taken by the Bank of Russia into account while making the decision on the key rate. Firstly, this is the change in external conditions, in particular oil prices and risks posed to oil prices and the global economy in general. Secondly, inflation dynamics and inflationary risks. Thirdly, economic dynamics. Fourthly, fiscal risks. Let me give more details on this trends and risks. External conditions. We have reviewed our baseline scenario and now proceed from the fact that the average price of Russian Urals crude oil will stand at $30 per barrel in 2016. It will then gradually go up to $40 per barrel in 2018. In the past few weeks, we have observed a certain recovery in oil prices, but how sustainable is a question. Price recovery is more attributable to market expectations of future price changes rather than actual changes in the oil market. The global oil market continues to see excess supply, record high level of stocks. This is suggestive of oil price risks. Oil prices are hard to forecast. The Bank of Russia proceeds from conservative estimates in order to be prepared for any development in the oil market. It is also important for the Bank of Russia that there remains persistently high uncertainty regarding world economic growth outlook. Central banks of most developed countries continue pursuing soft monetary policy, trying to overcome the threat of deflation. However, financial markets, despite the efficiency of soft monetary policy in the current situation, question the efficiency of such measures. As a result, volatility in the global financial markets remains high. Talking about inflation, the recent data of March 14 suggests that the annual inflation is at 7.9%. In February to March period, it was decreasing somewhat quicker than we anticipated. In January, we expected it to be at 8 to 9% in the end of first quarter. This takes me back to the 9% for March 2016 we forecasted a year ago. Average daily price increment in March was at the year's low. The performance is explained by several reasons. First, the constraints from the demand side are growing. Inflation is constrained by weak consumption as the monetary policy remains moderately high, and fiscal policy remains conservative. The growth rate of nominal wages both in public and private sectors, are all-time low. Furthermore, decreasing is the pressure on prices from the side of producers' payroll costs. Additionally, the deterioration in external climate is set to impact on domestic demand. The dwelling share of imports in consumption serves to downplay the response of domestic prices to the exchange rate fluctuations. The share of important products in retail sales for 2015 is down to 38% from around 44% that was seen between 2012 and 2013. The response of households is also of great relevance. Even as the ruble was weakening strongly, no upsurge in demand was seen from households in December, January. The resulting pass-through of exchange rate effect to inflation is continuing to decline gradually. It currently amounts to around 0.15 to 0.2. This is the second driver positive working in terms of inflation processes. Third, the global downward trend in price of food is ongoing. This impacts positively on important food prices and costs in the food industry. As a result, domestic annual food prices were growing in February slower than prices for non-food goods and services. Production costs are also pushed down somewhat by the declining global energy prices. Our estimates suggest that inflation decline will continue. This will occur driven mainly by the factors I've already mentioned: low demand, the current monetary policy, moderate impact from the exchange rate, and decreasing external prices. This refers to the decline in monthly and quarterly inflation. Annual price growth rates may accelerate in the middle of the year, but only on the back of the low base effect of last year, the statistical effect only in the second half of the year. As our forecast suggests, annual inflation is set to resume its decline, provided there are no new shocks emerging. Some pressure on 2016 prices is envisaged from increasing excise duties, those on fuel in the first place. Yet its impact is expected to be minor, about 0.5 percentage points into an inflation inclusive of all types of effects. Our baseline scenario suggests that annual inflation will total under 6%, decreasing to the target level of 4% in late 2017. Importantly still, inflation risks, that is, the risk that inflation may cease to decline, will decline slower on the way to the target, remain high. The core risk sources are as follows. First, oil market instability, I already mentioned that. Second, risks that elevated inflation expectations could remain. They're currently resuming to decline, but they remain high. It is crucial that the trend towards reduced expectations remains and becomes more sustainable. In the first place, this must be prompted by slowing actual inflation. However, confidence in the monetary policy implemented by the Bank of Russia is also of critical importance too. We're, by the way, very much concerned about elevated inflation expectations expressed by professional analysts and economists. Third, here we're faced with several uncertainties surrounding budget configuration, in particular prospects for extra indexation of pensions and wages. This risk source may be the most important. Balanced fiscal policy is essential for the economy given the change in external conditions. A ceiling on deficit and budget spending growth must be set down. Here we need a midterm clear strategy to reach balanced budget so that all economic agents are fully aware about budget deficit over 3 years horizon and about the sources of its funding. Consistent and responsible monetary policy is precondition for stable economic development as well as key prerequisite for low inflation and financial stability risks. Analysis shows that, all things being equal, more conservative fiscal policy allows for softer monetary policy and vice versa. Fourth, the prospects for a turnaround in global food prices. This would also have negative influence on annual inflation in Russia, as is normally the case for this time of year. There remains certain uncertainty regarding Russian crops, which could potentially influence prices in 2016. We take all these risks into account when making our decisions on the key rate. Talking about the economy, the dynamics of economic activity at the beginning of the year was somewhat better than we expected, considering the downturn in external conditions. The annual slump rates in consumption and investment are slowing down. Unemployment remains low. In February, annual growth of industrial production became positive, although it is too early to view this trend as steady. We see that economy is rather quickly adapting to a new reality due to positive trends that emerged last year. The floating exchange rate softens the influence of external shocks. Ruble depreciation boosted competitiveness, which supports agriculture, food, chemical, mining industries. There are signs of growth in the industries oriented to input substitution and exports, including non-energy exports. Besides, as for the economy structure in general, we see that so-called tradable sectors are feeling better. And by tradable sectors, I mean sectors, outputs of which can be imported, exported, sold in external markets, such as trading sector, construction. The economy adjustment to low level of export prices is not yet completed. According to the estimate of the Bank of Russia, in 2016, the economic recession will slow down. In making our key rate decisions, the Bank of Russia also takes into account dynamics of interest rates in the economy and ruble liquidity development. In the near future, gradual transition from banking sector liquidity deficit to surplus is possible. It could happen as early as in 2016. Liquidity surplus, let me remind you, means that banks' demand for central bank deposits exceeds their demand for refinancing. The main effect of such transition is liquidity inflow through the budget channel. It is possible when budget expenditures exceed its income, which is mainly financed from the reserve fund. In the course of this transition to surplus, money market rates might shift slightly within the Bank of Russia interest rate corridor, moving from its maximum to its minimum. Besides, amid liquidity surplus, the central bank's rate would rather act as reference rate for the deposit rate than for the lending rates of the banking sector. As a result, there might be a minor easing of monetary conditions, even under the unchanged key rate. We will continue to analyze very closely the liquidity situation and will take all developments into account when making our decisions on the key rate. That said, I would like to note that the existing system of instruments, the toolkit we have, enables us to effectively manage both liquidity deficit and liquidity surplus. We can conduct deposit auctions. In view of that, the key rate will remain an anchor for money market rates and other rates in the economy after the structural surplus emerges. Besides, we have a set of additional measures at our disposal to reduce liquidity surplus or slow down transition to it. Now, a few words about the new forecast and scenarios. We have reviewed our baseline and risk scenarios with different oil prices. In both scenarios, we reduced oil prices assumptions. The updated baseline scenario suggests, like I said, a sluggish recovery from the average of $38 per barrel in 2016 to $40 per barrel in 2018. The scenario is close to the risk scenario we released in December. However, the forecast for economic fundamentals is somewhat more promising than the baseline scenario in view of the more positive economy and inflation dynamics we're witnessing. We expect the GDP drop in 2016 to be at about 1.3, 1.5%, which is lower than in 2015, and close to zero growth rate in 2017. So minus 0.5 plus 0.5. GDP growth rate will become positive in 2018. The advancing processes of import substitution and non-energy export expansion will help gradual economic recovery. We also prepared a more negative scenario featuring persistent oil price decline to a lower level, which will remain for quite a long time. $25 per barrel during the 3-year period. In that case, we assume a GDP drop in 2016 to amount to 3%. Inflation will be more elevated than under the baseline scenario. It will exceed 7% by the end of 2016. Currently, we assess the probability of this scenario is low. In conclusion, I would like to speak about a few more aspects of our forecast. A few words about the balance of payments. We do not see any significant risks related to the current balance of payments. Our estimates show that under all scenarios, external debt payments will be processed smoothly. Import from exports and current account balance will decline given the low oil prices. It is clear, and the baseline forecast assumes a drop to $40 billion in 2016, 4.1% of GDP, and with a gradual increase to $50 billion in 2018. However, there will be no high capital outflow. According to baseline scenario, it will amount to approximately $40 billion in 2016, followed by a very slight increase. Therefore, we do not expect any significant changes in the Bank of Russia international reserves. The risk scenarios suggest a more prominent drop in exports, but also a little lower capital outflow than under the baseline scenario because of a contracted demand for foreign assets. However, the current account adjustment will be more substantial than that of financial account balance. Under this scenario, we consider an increase in the Bank of Russia foreign currency refinancing as possible. Overall, our estimates show that in midterm, Russian economy will adapt to changes in external conditions, even if they're more considerable. All of our scenarios suggest that over 3-year horizon, GDP growth will become positive and inflation will reach the 4% target. Thank you for your attention. I'm now ready to take your questions. Thank you, colleagues. We're now starting a Q&A session. For the first time, we have simultaneous interpretation during our press conference, so please don't forget to introduce yourselves and name the media you represent. Tatiana Chibasova, Interfax News Agency. I have 2 questions. One has to do with the press release. You mentioned that the Bank of Russia will be pursuing moderately tight monetary policy for a longer period of time than was initially anticipated. Could you explain what you mean by moderately tight monetary policy? What was the initial estimate, the initial plan, and for how long will it remain moderately tight in this new situation? Second question has to do with foreign currency assets and risk ratio. You plan to raise it. Has any decision been taken? Will there be any softening in regulation? And should risk coefficient on FX loans will be raised? Would that result in reduce an FX loans in 2016, in reduction of FX loans in 2016? As to why we're going to be pursuing a tighter monetary policy than initially expected, let me remind you our initial plans, if you remember, and last year, looking at the dynamics of the inflation, looking at the economic indicators, we forecasted that the rate could be reduced at one of the 3 forthcoming meetings. However, significant change in external situation and last year, beginning of this year, resulted in higher inflation risks. That is why at the last meeting, looking at the high increase of inflation risk, we signaled that monetary policy could be tightened. That said, we're looking at the factors that will have a downwards impact on inflation, like I said. And as we see that the trend becomes more stable, then in our baseline scenario, we could shift towards rate reduction. But again, provided there are no further risks, provided we're not in a risk scenario, we would like to avoid increasing rates because this is not a good policy, increasing, reducing rates. So taking into account the existing risks, we're pursuing this policy. We are conservative. We need to be convinced that the trend, inflation reduction trend, is sustainable and that the risks are going down. And only after that we would be able to start reducing rates. This is specifically what we meant in our press release. But as to when these or that decision will be taken, it will very much depend on the data we get by the time of the next board meeting. It will be end April that we're having the next board meeting, so we'll look at development, inflation expectations, different risks, whether they are becoming reality or not. This is our policy, and this is what we wrote in the press release. As regards foreign currency assets, we're seeing that a large share of foreign currency loans granted by banks to the real sector of the economy could result in systemic risks in the future, in case if borrowers have no income in foreign currency but still take foreign currency loans. So we're trying to reduce risks for borrowers through the steps we're taking. That is why we suggested to increase the coefficient on foreign currency loans. But like we said, we're going to be doing that very gradually, very smoothly. Well, like you said, we suggested certain stages for different sectors, for instance, construction and real estate, where there is no income in foreign currency. So we're continuing discussions with companies that have high share of income in foreign currency that use this to ensure their risks. If we find a good way to administer risks, then the decision could be taken anyways. This is a long-term policy aimed at reducing foreign currency risks that certain borrowers assume without having proper, clear idea of how important these risks are. Next question, Olga. Olga Tanas, Bloomberg Agency. If I may, about shift to surplus and ruble liquidity. What were the expectations for budget deficit for this year, and what are your forecasts for spending of the reserve fund you were based on when doing your forecast? And yesterday, Mr. Graf said that it is not impossible that the Bank of Russia could raise the rate in certain conditions. Could you comment on that, and what is the risk that the Bank of Russia would raise the rate this year? Well, in the baseline scenario, we proceeded from the assumption that funds would be used up gradually and would have about 2 trillion remaining by the year end. This year, the spending of reserve funds at about 3.8 trillion rubles. So this was, in fact, figures we used for estimates, but as the government specifies its forecast, we could fine-tune those figures. Indeed, the date where we could shift towards structural surplus would depend on how quickly those reserves are spent. Sometime during the year, we don't know exactly when, but we're getting prepared for that. We're getting prepared to respond to the situation once again. Shift from structural deficit to structural surplus is a very important development that should key rate remain unchanged. That would mean softening of monetary policy for certain economic agents. For us, it is very important to achieve our inflation target without raising the rate, and this is something we would like to avoid, and not just us. This is what the economy would like to avoid, all economic agents. So in order to avoid increasing rates, to control inflation, we need to have controlled budget deficit. This is why we're saying that it is very important to have balanced monetary policy, not just for 1 year, but for 3 years, to make sure that monetary policy is consistent, to make sure that economic agents understand how this monetary policy will evolve. This is why monetary policy should be balanced. This is why it is so important. And I think this is specifically what Anton Germanovich mentioned when he said that should deficit be too high, then the Bank of Russia might have to raise the rate. But like I said, fiscal policy, the tighter fiscal policy is the stuff and monetary policy could be, but we'd like to have them balanced, like I said, not too tight, not too soft. We need to find balance that would help us achieve our inflation target and guarantee sustainable economic growth. Olga, next question. Olga Koshchenova, Vedomosti. At the beginning of this year, we've seen for the first time in public opinion polls a trend that means that people that there are pro-deflationary moods in the society. People are reluctant to spend, to borrow. They are reluctant to make deposits in banks. They say that it's best to keep money at home. Should those moods become more explicit, there is risk of deflationary spiral in the economy. Are deflationary risks relevant to our economy? Oh yes, we've seen the results of these opinion polls, and changes in consumer behavior is an important factor that has impact on monetary policy. It is very important whether people are more inclined to save, to spend, whether it is organized or not. But we do not see that as an established trend, although there are certain moods in the society that are salient. But our analysis shows that in the forecast we're making for the 3-year period, there are no deflationary risks. We expect inflation to go down, but we don't expect it to move to the negative. Thank you. Mikhail. Mikhail Tegin, Banki.ru website. Good day, colleagues. I would like to ask a question about measures that the Bank of Russia will be taking in order to underpin the trend towards the reduction of inflation expectations. Reduction of inflation expectations largely depends on two factors. First, people are starting to have confidence in deflation, and will expect it, and it is very important to make sure that the actual inflation continues going down. So it should be sustainable. Sustainable trend is needed, because this is one of the preconditions to reduce inflation expectations. People usually believe when they see change in real life, when they see prices for consumer goods and jobs changing. Second, very important, is confidence in the policy of the central bank. So that people should be confident that even if there are factors that would increase inflation pressure, exchange rate or oil prices, that the Bank of Russia is equipped with a toolkit to control inflation and reduce inflation. That said, we're seeing that a weaker response to the change in oil prices in the beginning of the year is largely the result of the fact that we are conducting a tighter monetary policy, and our goal is to reduce inflation. This is something we're planning to be doing in the future. So these are two main factors that will have impact on the reduction of inflation expectations. Dmitry Butenko, Kommersant. This time, you published a very good press release, which is unambiguous, but I have a question with something that is not in the press release on monetary policy. Should oil price go up for a short period of time, for a month or so, over $50 per barrel, how would that impact the inflation situation, and what steps will you be taking in this situation? Well, we're trying not to respond to any short-term fluctuations because very often, and this is natural, that moods and forecasts change based on the dynamics and developments of the past week. We move from optimism to pessimism. Therefore, when analyzing on trends in the economy, we need to understand whether a trend in question is sustainable or not. So anyways, we'll try not to respond to any short-term fluctuations until we're confident that this is a long-term trend, unless there are risks to financial stability. In that case, we'll of course respond, but we need to understand what kind of a trend it is. And this gives an answer to a very specific question about oil prices. Next question, please. Елена Fabricne, Freighter Agency. The continuing strengthening of the ruble, is it a trend? And if so, what is the probability that the Bank of Russia will continue building its reserves and buying currency? You already started doing that in spring, and this is a trend we've been seeing for a number of years, every spring. And my second question is regarding your inflation forecast by the year end. Does that remain at 7.8? Because your analysts from the Bank of Russia in their forecasts mentioned different figures, 8 to 8.5%. So why is that your analyst forecasts differ from the official position of the Bank of Russia? Well, as regards the rate, the exchange rate, we're not convinced that it is a trend, because the factors that impact the rate might be volatile in the near future. So we do not consider that to be a sustainable trend, and we'll keep an eye on the situation, and should the trend emerge, we will take relevant steps as regards our operation in replenishing gold and foreign currency reserves. This could be done whatever the exchange rate is, but only after we are confident that this is not a temporary fluctuation. It would be a wrong thing to do to enter the market and then, as the volatility goes up, to leave the market. So, of course, it is up to analysts to see and decide whether the situation is sustainable or not, but there's no rush. We do not need to replenish gold and foreign currency reserves. They are stable, so we'll take a decision based on the situation, and if needed, we will enter the foreign exchange market. As regards our inflation forecast and baseline scenario, we forecast 6 to 7% in baseline scenario. A few months ago, we had an operational forecast, and you very often ask us about what's the operational forecast. Back then it was 7 to 8%, but now we see that the actual inflation is rather good, better than we anticipated. This is what I said, it's better than what we forecasted in January, but therefore we improved our forecast for inflation by the year end 6 to 7%. It is a large corridor because there are certain uncertainties, inflationary risks I mentioned before. Next question, please. Gulnara Vahitova, RIA Novosti. In your press release, the Bank of Russia mentioned that there's risk that inflation could deviate from the target 4%. Is the risk of deviation high? Is it moderate? Is it low? And the second question has to do with United States and European Union recommendations given to their banks not to participate in the placement of sovereign bonds of the Russian Federation. Do you think Russian banks are experienced and competent enough to do the placement, and whether Russia would be able to do placement without support from Western banks? What is your general view? Well, as regards the risk that will not reach inflation target by the year 2017, baseline scenario is positive. We will be able to reach the target. As to risk scenario, inflation there stands at 5.2, so there's a high risk we will not be able to achieve the target. In baseline scenario, taking into account lag in monetary policy, we see it as very probable to attain the goal using our toolkit and measures that we will be implementing through moderately tight monetary policy. As regards recommendation not to participate in placement of Russian sovereign bonds given by a number of governments, well, there are more markets, and I hope we'll be able to use their potential, although generally the situation in financial markets is, on the one hand, we see that there's a lot of interest, emerging interest among foreign investors to Russian assets. And we're looking at different financial indicators, CDS spreads, etc. But there are certain restrictions, and I hope that the Minister of Finance will take policy steps and together with foreign banks will be able to attract the funds needed. That said, the Ministry of Finance can substitute through domestic borrowings, and the capacity of the domestic market is high. Alina, next question. Alina Evtygnieva TASS. A strategic question, if I may. Would you consider doing like some other central banks to introduce not a fixed inflation target, but rather a corridor, 4 to 6%, for instance, since there is a risk that in 2017 the target will not be attained, or link it to GDP, like some other central banks do? Well, mostly central banks mandate and inflation has to do not with GDP share, but rather employment. We have discussed targeting nominal GDP, but most colleagues gave up on the idea because it is a very difficult process, statistically, administratively, and does not give any substantial advantages as compared to targeting inflation. As regards flexibility, well, our target, inflation target, is rather flexible, and any country that is targeting inflation, it is no country that targets inflation would say that inflation should stand at 4% or 2% for advanced countries every day. When we indicate 4% target, we say that it should stand, the average should stand at 4% over a given period of time. It should not deviate considerably. If you remember, when we first introduced inflation target, we had a corridor 1%, 1.5% for different factors to make sure that we do not have to respond through monetary policy to one-off factors. But now that inflation is far away from the target, there's no use in our view to talk about the corridor. We first need to achieve the 4%, and then we could discuss deviations. And this corridor, always perceived as 4% plus 4 plus 1.5, although the actual corridor is minus 1.5 to plus 1.5. So once we achieve inflation, not just one-off 4% inflation, but rather a sustainable target, then we will be able to do that. But we will be shortly preparing monetary policy plan for the next 3 years, and we'll discuss our flexibility, we'll discuss corridors as part of the preparation. Next question, please. Igor Zubkov, Российская newspaper. Since the monetary policy of the Bank of Russia might remain moderately tight for a long period of time, do you consider a possibility of expanding project finance alternative sources of funding for investment projects? Let me start by, well, I will talk about project finance, but before I do, I thought it was important to say a few more words about the moderately tight monetary policy. This does not necessarily mean raising or maintaining the rate. Should actual inflation be reducing faster, then moderately tight monetary policy could remain, even as the rate is somewhat reduced. We're talking about the nature of policy that definitely results in reduction in inflation. Therefore, this should always be linked with the current inflation and inflation risks. So this general comment is to explain to you what we mean by this moderately tight monetary policy. As regards project finance and all special instruments, we do indeed have special instruments at our disposal. We used to provide liquidity to banks at lower rate or for longer terms. Now, due to the shift from structural deficit to structural surplus, we're analyzing how efficient the rates are. Because if you have a threshold of 300 million, while you're giving 3, 5, or even 8 trillion to your banking sector, it's a different scenario when you give less than 1 trillion of liquidity to the banking sector, while in the past it was up to 4.8%. We might find ourselves in a situation where we need to absorb liquidity. So these tools have different importance for the monetary policy, but we'll be using those instruments in order not to send mixed signals regarding the monetary policy. This is the main principle, this is the number one principle, and that means that we do not have a possibility to increase annual spendings of such instruments. That means that we need to use the existing funds efficiently, because this instrument is scarce. We're analyzing efficiency. It does not mean that we'll be getting rid of all the instruments. Today, for instance, we decided to raise threshold of funding of XR by 25 billion and to support of SMEs by 25 billion. XR has already used up all of its limit, and the increase of the limit, well, still 25 billion is less than what was last year, was 50 billion. But we looked at the program again, and we've seen that it's a very good program. We have very good projects implemented under it, and we decided to add up additional 25 billion for SMEs. As regards project finance, we have certain doubt we have already expressed, because I believe that, having analyzed the project, we're seeing that many of the projects can be financed by commercial banks in general terms, and the resource that is scarce should be used wisely, only to finance projects that are needed for the economy, that are innovative, that cannot be funded by market instruments. So when it comes to project finance, right now we do not see a possibility to raise the cap. It has been used up by 75%. Let me remind you, for SMEs, about 40 billion has been used up. So other instruments to support the real sector can only be taken when we are confident that the scarce resource is used efficiently for the purpose it was designed to achieve. Next question, colleagues. Grigory Kogan-Lenteru. Recently, Mr. Graf mentioned that banks today need minimum liquidity from the Bank of Russia, and the influence of the key rate on the market is also low. Do you share his view? And what additional means could the Bank of Russia use? Indeed, the need for banks for the Bank of Russia refinancing has gone down. This is what I meant when I said that we're shifting from structural deficit of liquidity of the banking sector to structural surplus. Generally in the system, there is little liquidity deficit. We're seeing that some banks have surplus, others have deficit, but that varies from bank to bank. We might find ourselves in a situation where banks will no longer need funding from us. They will have enough deposits, they will have enough through budget channels. Whether we're going to be able to manage rates? Yes, naturally, but then transmission mechanism will change. If in the past the banks considered our refinancing as an indicator of the price of attracting resources, then in this situation we'll either do deposit auctions or use other tools, and this will not be considered as indicator for the rate to place funds. So we will be able to manage rates. They will remain in the corridor, so it's a key rate plus minus 1. In structural deficit situation, the rate is usually in the upper part. It could be up to maximum, that is 4 plus 1, but we've seen a different situation where we had to absorb temporary excessive liquidity in the bank, but it should remain in the corridor. This is something we take into account, and once again, we did take this into account, understanding that this shift from one situation to another means softening of the monetary situation for the banks. This is what you mean, and this is probably what was meant. Colleagues, just 2 more questions. Siranov Sharayan, RBC. I would ask you to clarify the parameters of scenarios. As far as I understand, there are 2 scenarios remaining. You gave up on the optimistic scenario, and do I understand correctly that the main parameter that will be influencing the 2 scenarios is the oil price, and the spread is not that big. It's $25 to $30 per barrel. And what are the differences between the 2 scenarios are there? Indeed, we did keep just 2 scenarios. We did not update an optimistic scenario. We have a whole range of old baseline scenarios which can now be considered as optimistic. So we now have 2 scenarios, baseline and risk. They do change next year, not in 2016, but then the difference is increasing. In the first scenario, we see oil prices recovering slowly to $40 per barrel, and in the second scenario, prices will remain sustainably low, at about $25 per barrel, which puts our economy in a different situation. Talking about potential growth, that would mean reduction in the potential growth of the economy, where you see that export good prices remain low for a long period of time. This is why many indicators differ. GDP dynamics, inflation, like I said, in the risk scenario, the probability that in 2017 we will not achieve our inflation target is rather high. And therefore, in risk scenario, GDP drop would be deeper. In our report on monetary policy that will be published this evening, we will have a detailed description of the baseline scenario, and will give certain figures and information about the risk scenario. Andrei Korzan, TASS agency, thank you very much for this news conference. My question has something to do with the monetary policy. We've heard many times from the Bank of Russia that you investigate all suspicious activity on the foreign currency market. You're looking for potential speculations. We've seen a number of instances, October 29, then December 2014. Have you already done an investigation? And have you seen any suspicious activity on the foreign currency market since the beginning of this year? Well, indeed, we are analyzing all the developments on the foreign exchange market, especially when there are signs of abnormal dynamics, volatility. But if I'm not mistaken, it was not on the 29th of October, but on 30th of October that there was suspicious activity. We did do an investigation, and we have not seen any signs of manipulations on the market. Indeed, volatility remains high on the market these days, and investors very often, and it is natural, are guided by news and developments, which comes as no surprise, but we're monitoring the situation. We're looking at all potential manipulations to make sure we avoid such things from happening. We have time for 2 more questions. Oksana, please. Oksana Kopseva, Reiter. We're now in the end of March. As of April 1st, theoretically, the Bank of Russia should decide whether to revoke good rates 4 and 6 norms calculations. So will you extend this beneficial regime? We'll consult the banks. At the moment, I do not see any good reasons to keep the benefit. The final question, please. Yulia Rakhvalova, Interfax. In your macroeconomic outlook, do you take into account risks that pension savings could be frozen in 2016? And is it probable at all that such a decision would be taken? Because if I'm not mistaken, it is being actively debated. When looking at macroeconomic parameters, we take into consideration the general budget situation, fiscal deficit, indexation of pensions and salaries that has impact on consumer demand. For our forecast, it is not important in terms of macroeconomic indicators, inflation and monetary policy, although it is very important in the long run. I mean, the future of pension savings. I think there is definitely a risk that they could be frozen because external conditions are rather negative, and time is needed for the budget to adapt to these external conditions to control fiscal deficit and when optimizing expenses. So the risk is there. I think the risk will always be relevant until the pension system is balanced, because the insurance part of pensions are largely funded through fiscal transfers. Had the system been more balanced, then the risk would be non-existent. Therefore, the priority task now is to find balance. Therefore, we are discussing a number of suggestions regarding the improvement of the pension system. We are discussing it with colleagues from the Ministry of Finance to make sure we preserve the savings part in order to guarantee in the long run rights of our pension holders and to make sure there's enough long money in the economy. Thank you very much, colleagues. Very interesting and very professional questions. Thank you.